Imagine classic Britain: fog, eternal light drizzle, umbrellas, and emerald green lawns watered 3 times a day. Now, forget that image. In the summer of 1976, that picture was literally scorched out of reality. Britain faced a climatic anomaly that meteorologists had not recorded in all 250 years of official observations. This wasn't just a hot summer, it was a climatic collapse. Temperatures in London and across southern England soared above 30 90 for 15 consecutive days, and in some spots, the mercury hit an insane for the islands 35.9. But the most terrifying part was something else. The sky over the country remained a defiant, almost mocking blue for a record-breaking 45 consecutive days. Not a drop of rain, not a single cloud. For a nation whose infrastructure, architecture, and even psychology were geared towards coolness and humidity, this came as a profound shock. Houses built to retain heat turned into glowing ovens. Air conditioning in 1976 was a luxury available only to major banks, and the stock of electric fans in shops evaporated within the first few days of the heat wave. But the real horror began when nature itself started to change its appearance. The famous English hills, praised by poets for their lush greenery, turned into dusty, yellow straw in just a few weeks. In Hyde Park and Regent's Park, the ground cracked open with fissures so deep a human hand could slip inside. Britain's rivers, its pride and transport arteries, began to vanish. The Thames grew so shallow in its upper reaches that one could cross it without even getting their knees wet. At the bottom of drying reservoirs, mystical things began to happen. The ruins of ghost villages, submerged decades ago to create water reserves, started rising from beneath the water. Old bridges, church foundations, and house walls that no one had seen since the 1920s were suddenly in the sunlight once again. People flocked to these shores to gaze at the ghosts of the past, realizing that if the skies didn't open soon, Britain was facing a humanitarian disaster. The government realized if radical measures weren't taken right now, within a month, there wouldn't be a single drop left in the taps of 50 million people. Thus began the era of the strangest and most absurd austerity regime in the country's history. When it became clear that the heat wave was not going to break, the government shifted from mere pleas to draconian bans. The first casualty was something of immense national pride for every Briton: gardening. An official hosepipe ban was introduced. From that moment on, using running water to water flowers, fill private swimming pools, or wash a car became a criminal offense. Violators faced a colossal fine for the time, up to $400, which is equivalent to nearly $3,000 today. Britain, a country that had always prided itself on unshakable personal freedoms, overnight became a society of total water resource surveillance. Special water board inspector patrols appeared on the streets. They cruised slowly through residential areas in unmarked cars, listening for the telltale hiss of running water. If a patrol noticed that someone's front lawn looked suspiciously fresh and green against the backdrop of the scorched desert all around, it was grounds for an immediate investigation. But the most remarkable shift happened in the public consciousness. Mass whistleblowing began to flourish in Britain. Neighbors who had politely greeted each other for years started spying over fences. If someone saw a neighbor attempting to water their roses with a hose under the cover of night, they immediately called the hotline. The water police were overwhelmed with reports. Newspapers of the era were filled with headlines about water criminals. and social pressure became so intense that washing a car even with a bucket was seen as the height of selfishness and anti-social behavior. Even the legendary fountains in London's Trafalgar Square were switched off and drained, leaving behind only dusty basins. Car washes across the country shut down, and the sight of a filthy car covered in a thick layer of dust became a symbol of patriotism and civic responsibility. In some counties, the situation grew so critical that public standpipes were installed in residential areas. This meant that water to homes could be cut off entirely, and people would have to queue with buckets as if it were wartime. The fear of this humiliation and the drive for survival forced the British to seek out the most absurd ways to save water, and that was when the government decided to propose something truly radical and personal. When the situation reached a breaking point, Prime Minister James Callaghan realized that ordinary bureaucrats were no longer enough. The country needed a hero, and that hero was Dennis Howell, who was officially appointed Minister of Drought. It was a unique position, created in an atmosphere of panic. Howell was a charismatic politician, and his task was the impossible: to convince a nation accustomed to comfort to start saving water as a matter of instinct. He didn't resort to boring lectures. Instead, he turned the struggle for water into a nationwide show. Howell started with himself. He publicly declared that bricks had been placed in his own toilet tanks to reduce the flush volume, and that his family didn't water even a tiny shrub in their garden. But his most famous piece of advice would go down in British pop culture history forever. At the height of the crisis, the government launched an advertising campaign that seems surreal today. Everywhere, on billboards, in newspapers, and on television, the slogan appeared: "Save water, bath with a friend." It wasn't a joke. Howell was dead serious when he urged Britons to share a bath with spouses, friends, or neighbors to avoid wasting an extra 80 liters of water per person. Overnight, an intimate procedure became an act of patriotism. Stickers, t-shirts, and badges with this motto began to be produced across the country. A nation known for its primness and desire for privacy suddenly found itself discussing exactly whom they were willing to share a bathroom with for the sake of saving the country. Howell went even further. He became the face of the national austerity regime, calling on people to use the same bathwater in turn for the entire family, from the father down to the youngest child. Furthermore, this grey water was not to be sent down the drain after use. It was carefully collected in buckets and reused for flushing toilets or for saving the most precious plants. The minister became so popular that people started sending him letters, asking if they could use pasta water to wash the dishes. Britain had turned into a massive laboratory for survival under scarcity, with Dennis Howell as the lead experimenter. His figure became a symbol of that strange summer, a mix of desperation, state regulation, and the classic British humour that helped people stay sane in the sweltering cities. By August 1976, life inside British homes began to resemble a long-haul desert expedition. Saving water had turned into a kind of obsession, giving rise to the famous rule still remembered by those who survived that drought. If it's yellow, let it mellow. If it's brown, flush it down. Flushing the toilet after every minor trip was considered almost a crime against the state. Toilet tanks across the country were modified with bricks or plastic bottles filled with sand to reduce the flush volume. Bathrooms smelled of bleach and stagnant water, But no one complained. It was the price of the nation's survival. People collected grey water from sinks after washing their hands and used it for flushing, turning a simple trip to the toilet into a complex engineering operation involving buckets and scoops. But nature had another surprise in store for the exhausted Britons, one that turned the summer into a literal horror movie. Due to the abnormal heat and lack of rain, there was a catastrophic population explosion of ladybirds. There weren't just many of them. There were billions of seven-spot insects filled every available space. They flew in thick clouds through cities, swarmed the walls of houses until they appeared blood red and covered beaches in a solid carpet. But the worst began when the insects ran out of their usual food. Aphids, which had died off as plants withered. Hungry ladybirds began to bite humans. The beaches, which were overcrowded that summer, with Britons trying to cool off in the sea, turned into battle zones. People fled from the biting insects, and newspapers ran headlines about the Red Plague and the invasion of the monsters. It was a surreal sight. Sweaty, unwashed Britons standing in queues at street standpipes with buckets in hand, fending off swarms of biting red beetles. The cities smelled of dust, burnt grass, and cheap deodorant, sales of which skyrocketed as people could not shower more than once every few days. Life in Britain in 1976 was a test of endurance, not only for the body, but for the nervous system as well. Society balanced on the edge between collective heroism and mass insanity, waiting for just one thing: a single drop of water from the sky. By the end of August 1976, the situation had reached its zenith. The government had already prepared a plan for a total water shutdown in residential homes. Millions of people were to transition to a strict ration from street standpipes. And that was when what Britons still call the greatest irony of the century occurred. Just 3 days after Dennis Howell was appointed Minister of Drought and officially called on the nation to pray for rain, the sky over the islands didn't just cloud over, it literally tore open. On August 27th, Britain was hit by downpours, the likes of which the country hadn't seen in decades. Thunder and lightning marked the end of the Great Drought, but the joy was quickly replaced by a new kind of chaos. The dry earth, as hard as concrete, simply could not absorb the water. Instead of soaking into the soil, torrents of water swept away everything in their path, turning parched streets into raging rivers. What began as a long-awaited rescue turned into a large-scale flood. Dennis Howell, who only yesterday was advising everyone to share a bath, suddenly found that his new task was to save people from an excess of water. The press immediately dubbed him the Minister of Floods, joking that he had overdone it with his prayers. Within days, Britain transformed from a frying pan into a massive swimming pool, and the very ladybirds that had terrorized the nation were washed away as suddenly as they had appeared. The summer of 1976 left behind not only millions of dead trees and billions of pounds in losses, but also a unique cultural legacy. It became the gold standard of British resilience and self-deprecation. Every time a hot week occurs in modern Britain, the media immediately recalls the spirit of '76. It was an era when an entire country voluntarily gave up hygiene and personal space for the common good, proving that even in the face of a red apocalypse of ladybirds and absolute drought, the British are capable of staying calm and carrying on drinking tea, albeit brewed with leftover pasta water. That summer became Britain's last truly wild decade. The scars and memories of which not even the heaviest rain could wash away.